Well, welcome to Navigating Immigration Today. I'm Iris Christensen, one of the co-hosts for this podcast.
And I'm Najib Azad, the co-host for this podcast.
During one of our first episodes, my co-host Najib and I shared our vision and for the mission of this podcast. Navigating Immigration Today, this podcast aims to shed a light on the realities faced by immigrants, their contributions to society, and the challenges that they face. So I imagine that you, our subscribers, have heard some of the recent news about immigrants who've been arrested, detained, and even deported without due process. Some of these people are immigrants with valid visas, green cards, even US citizens. It's one person, it was Kilmar Garcia. We've heard that story, I'm sure. He even had an order from a judge saying he should not be deported. And of course, there are the hundreds of Venezuelans, and now we know between 75 and 90% of them have no criminal records, who were kidnapped and sent to a foreign country's supermax prison, the Sacat prison in El Salvador. All of these actions by ICE, of course, with the blessing of our current administration, happened without due process. So our guest today, Luis Velasquez, he's very familiar with ICE actions to detain and deport undocumented immigrants, and now, of course, even immigrants with documents, and many people who have no criminal record. He's going to speak from his own experiences and his work with immigrants. But before we get started, Luis, I just wanted to say how I met you. It was actually just a few months ago in December. I attended a meeting of Voces de la Frontera just to find out what that organization was about and what they were doing. And I was so impressed right away with the way you talked to that audience. It was an audience of immigrants and allies, and you were calm, and no one else in that room was calm. You were the calm voice, but besides being calm and trying to get everyone else to maintain some sense of being calm, you said it was important that immigrants get in action now, not wait, not put it off, but the action they should take is to organize their documents, prepare their family members, and then you also spoke to allies, and you told us to organize and get into action. So soon after that meeting, you and I started doing Know Your Rights workshops where I was learning from you. You're my teacher and mentor, and finally I was able to do a couple workshops on my own. So I'm so glad you agreed to be our guest today. And I guess let's just start with you, Luis, telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing now.
Thank you so much, Iris and Najib, for this space and for this time of reflection and conversation. I think that we continue to live in a very vital and urgent time, not just for the immigrant community, but as a society where our democracy is in peril in many ways across, the different, layers of our lives. I think is very palpable. The fear and anxiety, the uncertainty that this, country faces from perspective of economy to, morality. I think that is, times where we will remember in the future that we, lived, through a time where, the rights of many, are being, threatened. And so I am a member of Voces de la Frontera, and the name is very, peculiar because it means voices of the border. And, one of the ways that I understand is that our mission and vision as the organization is to center those voices, those stories, those faces that come off the border, from the border. And how is it that through our action, through our advocacy, we can go ahead and just center them in the lives of those who may not know of the struggle, right, and the vitality, that immigrant communities bring. And so I am a, Voces members. My wife and I, we moved from Georgia to Madison in 2019. And I became a member through a workshop that was being done in Eau Claire. That's where I met the executive director of Voces, Christine Newman Ortiz. and it was through a workshop that was informational, giving information about the driver's license campaign. And so that's where I became, connected with Voices first as a member and then a volunteer. I served as a volunteer for a few years until I became staff in 2022. But I'm a son of immigrants. I am someone who is very proud of being an immigrant, and I know that nowadays it feels as though being an immigrant is not something to be proud of, right? But I still have that pride in being an immigrant because I know the history of the U.S. From so from the the contributions of those who are immigrants from Japanese to Chinese immigrants to Italian immigrants, Irish. This whole country has been built on stories and contributions of immigrants. So I'm so happy to share this space with you all.
Mhm.
Thank you so very much, Lewis, for giving us the opportunity to know more about you and to what you're doing and what people like you yourself have been doing. So I would like to ask you, can you just tell us about one of the immigrant families that you or another colleague with Voices has worked with and describe their situation?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, because I think that's a way to personalize all of the news that we're hearing, and there's a lot of, I mean, as your listeners, probably know, Voices has been creating spaces where immigrant families can come, with experts and talk about their plans. And unfortunately, there is, I mean, a probability, right, for immigrants who may have a vulnerable immigration status who need to plan ahead, right? And so Voices has been offering these spaces, these, sessions where, families can come together and complete their power of attorney forms, either for finance or for temporary custody of their children. And we have been doing this since late November. And there's been a lot of families who I've met in this journey of just, sitting down with them and just, planning ahead. And it is something very unfortunate, to be even thinking about. Um, but I do remember this family back in March. They came to to our clinics, and it was a very interesting case because the parents, had been here for over 15 years. They came with their children, two minors, and one of them was an adult, right? And as we were conversing, the family, was sharing, with me that they wanted to be ready, that, they had been very, very hesitant about doing this, and that they were going to designate um, essentially all of the authority to their daughter, who was just 18 years old. She's still in high school. And it was heartbreaking for me. And of course, I'm used to it, right? And so, in what ways can we, just sit down with them and provide, the calmness and the information that they need? Um, and the family was very noble, very humble, hardworking folks, who had been here in the state of Wisconsin for over 15 years. Um, and it was a very heart-moving experience because the daughter shared that it was the least that she could do, and she was just sharing and said, no, I want to make sure that my family feels safe and that they have a sense of peace. Um, but I do remember sensing, the resiliency and the power, um, and just how full of love they were, even in the midst of ambiguity and uncertainty. But it was a powerful image of where we were in March, considering that all of these dangers can come to their family. And now, granted, the daughter who is 18, she's a U.S. citizen, um, and just thinking of their own story and thinking how complex their stories have been, and the fact that they don't have a pathway for citizenship, right? How they've tried and they have said, what, I've done my taxes, I've done everything that I could do, but there just isn't a pathway, for citizenship, for me. And I do remember in that conversation hearing from them the frustration, right, that they felt and perceived that in the last 4 years, they had heard and met immigrants who had come to the States, who had a permit, who had a way to drive here in the state of Wisconsin. However, they couldn't. And so they were very, frustrated at the fact that not all immigrants have that right. And so how our immigration system is broken. And I think it just went into the heart of our immigration, system, and how it's broken for many, many years, and how they are, victims of this, system that in many ways, it abuses, their labor, in, the fact that, here they are, and they have worked and done taxes and done everything right in the last, 15 years. However, they don't have a pathway, for citizenship, and now they need to plan ahead in case they're detained and deported.
You just mentioned about those immigrants and what they have been doing in the last couple months, particularly after these new executive order. And the executive orders, the terms or the phrases they used were for all immigrants or all refugees. But I just read this morning that I'm feeling good for them. I'm happy for them. For those white South African, the first flight just arrived. So when we talk about all immigrants, or even like those who fought the American War, particularly the Afghans who fought for the United States interest and global values for 20 years. They were the American partners. They have been waiting for their flights in third countries for 3, 4 years, and they're in a very bad situation. And then those in here in the United States, who most of them are documented. They were investigated, they were inspected, they were admissible, but they are being deported. But white South African are arriving. I mean, the first flight arrived to the United States. What are your comments, or what do you think about this?
Right. I think that, as my grandma used to say, we judge them by their actions, right? And today, happens to also be the day that the Trump administration has formally lifted a shield on deportation of Afghans in the US. And they are arguing that there's improving conditions, right? Which we can argue that it's not the case. And so we see a double standard. And I think that immigrants across the US see a double standard, right? And I think it's, racialized. This system has become, racialized, and it is, sending a clear message, across the board. So definitely, I think that for those who are indigenous, for those who are black, brown, it is something that we have to deal with. And this administration has been very, very clear and just public about where their priorities are, in terms of, who they think that, should be in this country and not.
Mm-hmm. So are there other things that you've heard, these comments made by officials in this administration about immigrants that you think lead to that kind of discriminatory treatment? Are there phrases they use or specific language that's used, not maybe just by this administration, but by others that concern you?
Right. I think it's the persistent focus on finding a way to criminalize immigrant, families, right? And again, and I think that we talked about this, before, is that, the narrative that they've been, perpetuating is that those immigrants of Latin America or of the Middle East are people who are coming to poison, the well. It is the kind of, rhetoric that has become, very dangerous. But I think it is also a continued inaction that directly impacts immigrants and working class communities, meaning that they haven't been able to get into the heart of the issue. For example, we've talked about how the immigration, system has been broken for over 30 years, right? And so this focus on persecuting immigrants who 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 allegedly have, felonies, right? Um, is something that they are focusing in, right? However, they are leaving millions of immigrants who are everyday Americans, who are everyday, workers, who are sustaining the economy of the U.S. And that has been left alone, untouched. For example, DACA recipients. We know that in the U.S., there are a group of the so-called dreamers or DACA recipients who have been in the country, many of them over 20 years. They have received a permit giving the executive order in 2012. But for DACA recipients, they don't have a pathway for citizenship. That has been left untouched. The human, parole that about 1 million immigrants were recipients of, which was something that the Biden administration did, which is a result of our asylum laws. Now, for example, that's also left in the limbo. And so it's this, strategic and tactical, persecution of immigrants, regardless of any type of criminality, right? And so that's the narrative that they are building on purpose. But however, most of us know that that's not the case. And I talk to people every day, to allies, to immigrant families. And on the ground, there is a lot of, farm workers and farm owners who are very worried about the uncertainty, and they're worried about their workers and how they are coming to find out that some of them don't have an immigration status. And so I think it is this tidal wave of fear and exploitation and political attacks that are not um, fostering an environment of growth and progress. On the contrary, and so I think that we should focus on the inaction, on the fact that this administration, that they haven't really brought forth real change on the table for those systemic, problems that have been the illnesses of this country for many, many years. And so I think I would like to focus on that,
Yeah.
just because I think that this government has been very, very strategic on making sure that they control the narrative, that they are going after so-called, criminals. And I must also, remember and just remind, your listeners, for example, here in the state of Wisconsin, if you are caught driving without a license, more than twice, it can become a felony. And so we know that that there's a lot of immigrants here in the state of Wisconsin who don't have a legal status, who have tried to apply for some sort of permit, but it doesn't exist. And so that is the heart of the issue that hasn't been solved by none of the presidents in the last 20 years. And so I think it is also a call for this administration to take action and to actually solve problems that are facing, U.S. citizens, right? Because we know that, whatever happens to an immigrant family will happen to the rest of the community, especially now after COVID. I think it's something that we do remember that if it happens in a certain area, it will affect us. Sooner than later, it will affect us.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you're pointing out so many important things. And one of the some of the language I hear from people that are my race are that they refer to immigrants as criminal aliens. And that phrase just troubles me so much, because a word like alien doesn't apply to a human being, and it's a way of dehumanizing the person, and then also calling them criminals when being an undocumented person, it's not a crime. It's a misdemeanor. And the other thing I hear from people too often is that they think, oh, it just would be so easy to have the pathway to citizenship. It's as easy as going to get a driver's license. And you just explained that's not so easy either. But
Right.
why don't people just become documented? It's easy. Just go to whatever office you need to go to, pay a small fee, and then you should be able to get your documents. Why don't people just do that? So can you talk a little bit more about what needs to change? and how these different attitudes need to change.
Yeah, no, and I think that you're pointing out a real, life experience, right? That as we, refer to immigrants, and I think that we hear it, sometimes, especially as we travel into, rural areas, right? We hear the words, I mean, illegals, right? We're aliens. And I remember, someone just talking to me about, long time ago about the word, I mean, illegal, right? That, for example, if someone crosses a traffic light, someone who will, cross a red light, right? And that person will be, detained and, will be, given a ticket, right? That person is not called illegal because they broke the law, right? And so it's something that is done just for immigrants, but it's so entrenched in the law, right? If you read, and I think Iris, better than I do, right? As an attorney, whenever you read this memorandums and you read, these legal, resources, the verbiage, right? They use illegal aliens. And in that way, I mean, it is, perpetuating the dehumanizing aspect of immigrants, right? And so I think it is very dangerous. It's easier to abuse someone if you are taking their humanity, right? And so I think language is very important. I think we could use immigrants, we could use people who don't have a legal status, right? Because we put forth people first, right? People who don't have a legal status, or undocumented migrant is another phrase that we can use. And I think that, especially in this age, I think it's important to know how we can refer to those who are immigrants, because to migrate, it is something so natural, right? We see, butterflies, we see birds, they migrate, and they don't know any borders, right? And so it's something that is intrinsically humane, and natural, right? To migrate, and I think that's something that we should rediscover, right? Because there's so much richness in being an immigrant and being able to move, from one place to another. Now, granted, there's different stories, right? There is the yearning and longing of immigrants who have to leave their home because essentially their house is burning, right? It's on fire. They have no choice. And there's also immigrants who come to the US, right, to be lawyers, to be doctors, who come to offer, the best of themselves, right? And so I think that's the narrative that we need to continue to build and, and continue, to lift up. Um, and so I think that, from language, from even being in solidarity, and that's why the march in May 2nd and May 1st was just an expression of love and compassion and justice. The fact that we came together to listen to different stories and to celebrate, who we are, even in the midst of uncertainty. And I heard from immigrant families who came to march with us on May 2nd, which was a statewide march, to stand together, for driver's licenses and to stand together in solidarity for immigrant rights. And I heard, just the fact that we were together with other people who were able to lift up the stories of their ancestors, right? The fact that none of us here, belong to this earth, right? It was our indigenous siblings who were here. And so it was something great to listen to and to be reminded and to be rooted. And unfortunately, there is a big disconnection of those who are in power and those who are on the ground. And I would even just say the majority of us have a positive attitude and appreciation of immigrants and their contributions. And unfortunately, part of the issue that has happened, um, is that there's been a takeover of the billionaires. There's been a systemic issue now, for many years, where the middle class has been shrinking, and this has been happening with immigrants, but also with white low-wage workers, right? And so part of the reason why Trump won was because he was able to divide workers. He was able to divide, the immigrant community. But, when I talk to low-wage white workers, they have also a similar challenge, right? They cannot get ahead, right? But the issue is not immigrant families, right? The issue is the system that has not allowed them to thrive. And so I think that we need to be reminded of that, instead of scapegoating immigrants, um, it is the system that hasn't benefited us as workers, and so I think that I would love to remind, the listeners, that it's something that we need to talk more about, you know, uh, so the rights of workers, independently of their immigration status and independently of the fact that they're immigrants or not.
Good point.
Although we may have many questions and we don't like you to go, but since we don't have enough time, you just briefly mentioned about the march early this month. So you have the experience of getting people together based on those experiences, and then your personal connection with many around you. Are there any actions that you believe allies can do now to support immigrants even more? Although there are a lot of people, there are a couple thousand people that have been doing that, and you have witnessed that early this month. And I would also like to know, and of course our listeners would love to know, any future events just like the ones that you had early this month.
Yeah, no, thank you, Najib. So tomorrow, May 13th, for example, there's a hearing on AB 24 and SB 57, and there's going to be probably a couple of other hearings here in the state of Wisconsin about these bills that essentially is trying again, right, to criminalize immigrants, right? So they want to make it easier. And when I say they, unfortunately, in this case, it is Republicans in the state of Wisconsin who are trying to force sheriffs, to force all the sheriffs in the 72 counties of Wisconsin to work and cooperate with ICE. And so it is a danger, I mean, essentially to our whole economy, because there are immigrants right now on the ground who are talking to organizers and saying, you know what, I mean, we think that Wisconsin may not be, friendly, for immigrant, workers. And so we must be reminded that, Minnesota, for example, right, they have different policies that are more, favorable to immigrants. We have Illinois. And so it poses a threat not just to families, right, who are immigrants, but also to our whole economy. Who is going to milk our cows? Who's going to keep our restaurants going? And so these two bills are trying to make it easier to detain immigrants who don't have a legal status and to deport them. And so there's a hearing tomorrow, May 13th at 10 a.m. at the Capitol, 411 South. And then there will be other, hearings that will be, promoting. For example, we continue to follow the case with Judge Dugan as well, because it is something that we have been facing just in the last few weeks. Direct attacks against our judicial system, direct attacks against our governor, direct attacks against immigrant families, direct attacks against employers as well. And again, who are stuck in this limbo, who want to make sure that their businesses are going, just want to make sure that also that their workers are, thriving, but there isn't a pathway for citizenship. That's why I wanted to focus on that. That's the challenge, right? And so I think that we need to continue to advocate for solutions. And I think we cannot be distracted, right? That's the heart of the matter, is that there's millions of immigrants who do not have a pathway for citizenship, who are workers, who have paid their taxes, who have done things by the book. However, there isn't anything for them to apply for, and that's the issue.
So true. Luis, we're at the end of our time for today, but Najib and I want to thank you so much for the courageous work that you're doing, your words today, and for joining us in this work to get this information out to the public. I'm sure our listeners now have a much better understanding of the current situation faced by immigrants because of what you're doing and what you've said. So thank you, listeners, for joining us today. Until next time, take care and remember to navigate with compassion.